Europe is a relatively minor player in this debate at the moment, and I think Europe wants to stay that way. It's worth actually looking back over the events that have taken place over the last year to see what is the position of Europe and what are the developments that we can expect. Now, you all remember that it started with respect to Europe, with respect to steel and aluminium. There was this little dance between March and June about who was actually going to get the tariffs on steel and aluminium. The US first said to Europe, well, maybe you don't get them if you propose something. Europe said, well, we're not going to talk about this because we don't really think that there was a national security issue, so that they got the tariff in June. Now, and the tariffs are still applied. Now, what was the response of Europe to those tariffs? It's a very, I think, civilized and measured response in the sense that they considered that the justification in terms of national security was not credible. So they went to WTO saying that they would challenge this justification for the tariff, that they would consider the US tariff have safeguards, and because they looked at them as safeguards, they would apply countermeasures. And so they did design countermeasures. And these countermeasures are relatively smart, actually, in the sense that they have imposed their own tariffs. They have done it in such a way as, I think, to compensate for the benefits that the producers of steel and aluminium in the US would get, in the sense that they have actually imposed tariffs on the same products in order to essentially annul the effect of the protection that was put forward in the US. They have tried to the extent possible to focus on final consumer goods rather than intermediate inputs, because they don't want to put the competitiveness of European firms in danger. Mm-hmm. They have also tried to find products for which there were very close substitutes, because, I mean, if indeed you have a tariff in Europe with respect to a US product, I mean, the effect is going to be maximum if there is a clear alternative. I mean, the trade effect is going to be maximum if there is a clear alternative to which the European importers would turn to. And finally, they have tried to target products which are produced in the US in sensitive areas from a political point of view. I mean, there's the Kentucky bourbon, this is the Harley Davidson and so forth. So I think that the response was relatively measured and was also trying to stay within the rules of the international systems of governance for trade, within the rules of the WTO. Now, during the summer, there was then sort of an exchange between the EU and the US, and actually mostly between the president and the EU. First, the President Juncker went to see President Trump in July and said, well, if you're really upset about the trade imbalances between the EU and the US, well, let's talk about a free trade deal. I mean, you seem to be concerned about barriers in Europe. Let's talk about removing barriers and removing the tariffs in Europe. And first said, well, we're willing to talk about this, but without cars. And then in August, I mean, the Commissioner for Trade said, okay, we're also willing to talk about cars. So let's remove all the barriers with respect to imports on cars. Now, how do we interpret this? I think that this is essentially cheap talk. It's cheap talk because it's clear that the US doesn't really want free trade. I mean, and it's clear that in the narrative of President Trump, you both have sometimes this sort of idea that you want free trade, that you want to remove the barriers, but you sometimes also have an opposite narrative, which is isolationist, which is mercantilist, which is this idea that trade is a zero sum. I mean, that he comes back to all the time. And essentially, by putting forward this proposal for a negotiation on a free trade deal, what Europe is doing is calling his bluff. He say, okay, I mean, you want free trade sometimes, okay, let's do free trade. And of course, he's not going to do free trade. So in a sense, I mean, it is an empty talk. But it's also empty talk, I think, from the perspective of Europe, because Europe at the moment is not in a position to negotiate anything that would look like a free trade deal. Because if the Europe wants to liberalize, or if the Europe would consider liberalizing trade with the US, it cannot do it on an FM basis. I mean, there is no way that you can extend the benefit of a free trade agreement with the US to all the other trading partners of the EU. So it would have to be in the context of a specific free trade area with the US. similar to what was negotiated 3 years ago. Maybe a much more reduced version, but it would be similar to that. Now, but in order to do that, you need, or the Commission at least, needs to have a mandate from the Council to negotiate. And there is no way that the Commission is ever going to get a mandate to negotiate that with the US in the current environment. Because it's the last date of the last year of the European Commission. There is European election next spring. I mean, the member states are not going to grant this to the European Commission. And in any event, I mean, there is a lot of resentment about the fact that the US has left the Paris Agreement. And President Macron has said openly there is no way we're going to make a free trade deal with anyone who has left the Paris Agreement. So I think that it's essentially empty talk. The EU is not credible. I don't think the US is credible either with respect to the prospect of having a negotiation on a free trade deal, which would be wide-ranging, which would actually include all the industrial products. But then there is autos, because repeatedly over the spring, the president has said autos is a problem, and maybe we're going to put tariffs on autos from Europe. So it's worth sort of thinking about what could happen with respect to autos. The first thing to observe is that it's not entirely clear that it is in the interest of the US to impose tariffs on autos at the moment. I mean, currently the tariffs on autos coming from Europe are very low. It's about 2%. Now he's talking about raising the tariff to 20%, yet the US auto industry is operating close to capacity. So, I mean, if there is a 20% tariff on European cars that account for a large chunk of the imports in the US, this is likely to lead to, in the short run, to increase in prices that could be substantial for US consumers. So it's not clear that actually, from this perspective, even raising a tariff on European cars is such a great idea because of the consequences on the final consumer prices. Now, besides the fact that it's not necessarily in the interests of Trump to do so, it's also worth wondering what would be the response of the EU. Now, would the EU actually, in particular, accept a deal with the US in which there would be further liberalization with respect to cars only? Okay? So instead of having liberalization with respect to all products, you might think, okay, I mean, is there a prospect for a deal with respect to liberalization for cars only, similar to what has been negotiated with Korea? Now, that essentially means that if it's only for cars, it would have to be, again, on an MFN basis. It would not be part of a bilateral trade agreement between the US and the EU. So if you do only car, it has to be on an MFN basis. But the problem with that is Japan and Korea, because Japan and Korea account for the bulk of imports of cars into Europe. And Japan and Korea just signed free trade agreement with the EU. So if the EU is now saying, okay, we are going to have a reduction in the tariffs on cars coming from the US, currently about 9%, bring them down to 0, Korea and Japan are going to say, okay, this is no good. I mean, because we just actually agreed to bilateral market access. I mean, we actually accepted to have market access in agricultural product in Korea and Japan in exchange for market access to cars. You can't sort of the next day, reduce the tariff on US cars. So I think that's a non-starter. I mean, there is no way that the EU is going to think about reducing the 9% tariff on US cars, or more generally to consider a reduction in the tariff on an MFN basis. Now, the other problem that the EU faces is that, I mean, cars is not an EU problem. It's essentially a German problem. And actually, more generally, the issue of the trade surplus of the EU with respect to the US is mostly a German problem. So any outcome in terms of trade management that arises is an outcome that will have to make sure that the rest of Europe, besides Germany, is not harmed. Because the rest of Europe sees that very much as a German problem, so that it will have, in a way or another, have to respect some sort of neutrality with respect to the other countries, but Germany. Okay, so that's a lot of constraints. It means that we can't reduce the tariffs because of Korea and Japan. It means that if there is a deal, it will have to be a deal that, is essentially making Germany to contribute to, whatever is agreed. The only possibility would be something similar to what has been done with Korea, is a voluntary export restraint. That would be great because it would harm the Germans. I mean, actually, it would not harm the Germans because the German manufacturers would benefit from the price increase in the US, so they would get some additional profits, so it's not clear that they would be against it. So voluntary export restraints essentially of German cars. The rest of the EU wouldn't be affected too much. Of course, I mean, US consumers would be affected because prices in the US would go up. You know, that's the potential outcome of this, is a voluntary export restraint like that of Korea. But honestly, I doubt that this will come through for the same reasons that I mentioned earlier in terms of the electoral cycle. I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult for the EU to accept that when there are some European elections in the spring. And I think the EU would be very concerned about the precedent. I mean, if you do voluntary export restraint with the US with respect to cars, I mean, why not do it in other instances? And the EU is really committed, I mean, not to use these instruments of trade management. So what I see there is no clear outcome in terms of a potential negotiation between the EU and the US. What we might see is that President Trump forgets about it for a while and then we don't see anything. What we might see is a tweet next week which says 20% tariffs on European cars. And I think that, if that happens, there is not going to be anything in terms of the response from the EU that is going to be, directed to a discussion on cars alone. Is going to be the same that they did last year. That is to say, to impose some that they did this June, to impose some countermeasures. Now, let me just sort of make two comments which relate in particular to what Petros has said earlier, which is that, I think Petros, is asking an important question. He's asking, has the US already left the WTO? And to my mind, the US has actually left the WTO because the US has imposed tariffs that are against, all the WTO rules, and they have added insult to injury by saying that this is because of national security, okay? So they have sort of come up with this sort of ludicrous idea that having tariffs on cars is something that you can justify by national security, and that's insulting. So it's worth then considering what the world would look like if we do the WTO without the US. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, I think this is already happening. The ministers of trade for a number of EU countries, the European Commissioner for Trade, the ministers of trade of Canada, Hong Kong, not China, are meeting this week in Canada in order to think about what the reform of the WTO could be. So I think that one of the consequences of what is happening, in particular with respect to China, is that it's sort of leading to the realization that it's worth thinking about a counterfactual, which is a counterfactual in which the US is no longer part of the WTO.
I guess I'm going to be, unlike all of my colleagues, I'm going to be the pessimist and try to put a little bit of numbers on this. I was part of I signed a letter that was along with 1,000 economists arguing that this was a really bad idea. I think the last time a letter like that went out was right before the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the Great Depression, and that didn't work out so well. But let's see how we're doing. So I guess the question that we're all trying to understand is Trump's statement that trade wars are good and easy to win. What I kind of want to spend some time doing in my 10 minutes is talk a little bit about how it's going for us and the rest of the world. So in order to evaluate our policy, I think it's worthwhile spending time on what it is that the US thinks it's trying to accomplish. So we're trying to increase employment. That is one of the big targets of our policy. We're trying to reduce the trade deficit. That is another second important element of the president's strategy. And the third thing, as people have mentioned, is that we're trying to preserve the value of US intellectual property. USTR, I don't know how they did this estimate, but they probably talked to a couple of executives, and came up with some number of $225 billion per year in loss. We're in New York. We used to have a mayor who used to ask the question, so how are we doing? So let's think about those three objectives one at a time. So first, what's happened? So initially, we started putting tariffs on solar panels and washing machines in February. added aluminum steel, then hit China with round 1 of tariffs, hit Turkey with aluminum and steel tariffs. China again we hit in August, and then in September we hit China again. So we've got about $300 billion worth of imports getting hit by US tariffs. Now, in a trade war, it's not just one side whacking another side. There are other countries involved in trade, I think by definition. And so you might want to ask, what's the foreign reaction? The answer is this picture. So it's not just our imports that are getting hit with tariffs. Our exports are also getting hit by foreign tariffs. So China was first in the game in April, and then Mexico joined in, EU doing something relatively minor in June, Turkey also coming in, Canada now coming in, China, Russia, and then China, and then we've got India laying in. So roughly, currently, we've got 300 billion of imports getting hit by US tariffs of around 20%, but these countries are now levying tariffs of around 30% on about $150 billion worth of our exports, or about half of the value of what we're hitting. So, and these numbers, as you can see, are going up, and then the question is that a trend, or are we going to back down? One of the things that's also really important is the second objective that I talked about, which is intellectual property, right? So basically the way to think about that is there are a lot of multinationals that are operating in China, and the concern is these multinationals are losing profits to Chinese competitors who might be taking money from these multinationals. So we're going to hit China with these tariffs. But what is China? Well, did a little bit of digging onto what China is. It turns out China is us. Because if you look in computers, you can see that 86% of the goods that we're hitting with tariffs are produced by non-Chinese multinational corporations. So a lot of that is, our own companies that have operations in China. The goods coming in from our companies are getting hit by tariffs in order to teach the Chinese a lesson not to hurt our companies. You can see if you look at electrical equipment, appliances, you're at about 2/3 of the companies are multinationals, machinery, et cetera. So very much we're hitting our own companies in doing this, and that's because supply chains are fairly complex, and defining what is a Chinese company or what is a U.S. company is actually often can be difficult, and a lot of what seems in the trade data to be Chinese companies are actually U.S. subsidiaries. So we can now turn to employment, that other objective that we're going after. And it's really interesting that we decided to pick on steel. Steel is a great example of what happens when you put tariffs on goods, because the U.S. has done this a lot. Starting around 1995, we began hitting steel imports with tariffs, not just on China. You can see that there's a big increase around 2000 under Bush, and then again following the financial crisis under Obama. We also did a lot of protection on steel. Big movements in China, but also big movements on the rest of the world. So just to kind of fix ideas, tariffs on, in 1995, about 20% of all steel imports were hit with tariffs. By 2017, we've had about, that number has more than doubled. So we can then kind of think, well, okay, we kept doing this 2000, 2008. What happened to employment in steel? And what happened to production in steel? Well, there's the plot. You can see that basically from 1995, when we started doing the protection, to now, the top line indicates that steel production has been largely flat. But if you then look at the blue line, you can see what's happening to employment in steel. Well, when I look at that, I see that there's a long-run downward trend in employment. And it's punctuated in two locations. you can see here and here, this is where we did the tariff increases. So if anything, the steel employment seems to have fallen faster in the wake of the tariff increases. But the long run story in steel is not that the protection caused the steel industry to expand. You can see that the yellow line is pretty flat. But that there's been a lot of technological progress in steel, and that technological progress, robotics, et cetera, is accounting for a downward trend in the industry. What about aluminum, the other metal that we want to protect? Well, that's the red line. Again, looks kind of similar to steel, just a downward trend in employment. So at least if the past is any evidence, we're not getting a lot of steel jobs as a result of this. We'll get higher steel prices. So then the question comes, why doesn't protection create jobs? And here there's two main answers, right? The first is the technological change, and the second is that when you protect an intermediate input like steel, that raises the costs of all the firms that are using steel as an input. For example, cars. But if you raise the cost of producing cars in the United States, they are going to then sell less at home. That's going to reduce their demand. You end up with fewer steel inputs, and you end up with less car production. And these companies are going to move abroad, and there's a tendency for you to actually lose jobs in those sectors. But let's go to our third target. Maybe we're doing better on that one. There was a prediction that if you start exports, net exports, or the trade balance is mechanically exports less imports. If you put the protection on the imports and drive down the imports, well, maybe that is going to improve the trade balance. Standard economic theory says that's not how you improve the trade balance, and also you're seeing that our exports are now getting hit as well. But there certainly was a major selling point of this, so you have that prediction that we should be seeing the trade balance improve. So I just, a couple days ago, I downloaded the data on the trade balance, and it looks like this. It looks like it's going in the opposite direction. And raises the question, who you're going to believe, Trump or your lying eyes. The reason for the downturn is fairly clear if you've studied basic national income accounting. The trade balance is equal to domestic savings investment balance plus the government budget deficit. We just passed a huge tax cut. The deficit is ballooning, right? That's got to drag down the trade deficit, and there you can see it right there in the data. So it doesn't seem like we're winning on that score either. How about some overall impacts on prices? So here's Wilbur Ross telling us about why it is that the steel tariffs aren't going to affect chicken noodle soup prices. But let's take a look at the first tariffs that have been put into place. These tariffs hit washing machines. That's the ones in February, and we're seeing that we now have about 6 months worth of data on that, so we can actually trace out whether Wilbur Ross is right or not so right. So here's the CPI for washing machines, and you can see that washing machine prices were going down, 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 and then we hit them with tariffs, and not surprisingly, washing machine prices are now going up, up, up. So it certainly is looking like these things are filtering into prices. And this data for washing machines we can actually are seeing more broadly through a load of different prices. And so clearly consumers are going to get hit by these higher prices. Of course, I'm in a business school, so I have to talk about the most important prices, which are stock prices. And here we're also getting some clear evidence about the aggregate costs of this. This is just to the companies that have listed listed companies. And there have been some event studies that have been done which look at the impact of different announcements on stock prices. So let's just focus first on the S&P 500 returns. And you can either look at the movements of the stock prices on the day that the US or China made announcements, or you can look over a 3-day window before and after that, and see that not all announcements have a negative sign, but if you look over the announcements that were done between between March and June of this year, the cumulative decline is around 2.5% for the United States and about 13% for China. And obviously, this is impacting lots of countries as well. And then you can just take that number and multiply it by the market cap of all those companies, and you see that just the announcements alone through June have shaved about $741 billion off the U.S. market. So that's about 4% of U.S. GDP. And more is clearly coming. So on that happy note, I'm going to end, and we can open it up for discussion.
Thank you, David. Thank you.